since the FCA launched Project Innovate around 18 months ago, we have had over 400 requests for support, and we've been able to offer direct and indirect support to over 200 firms as part of that. Those firms met our criteria for Innovate, which is they are genuinely innovative ideas, and we believe that ultimately those firms can bring some kind of benefit to consumers. Project Innovate's been a really vital part for us of developing and delivering our competition objectives. But it's also for us very much a living piece of work. It's something that is going to adapt and evolve over time. We've already made some changes to it. And I wanted to spend my time today really talking about the very latest piece in that evolution, the regulatory sandbox. However, just before I did, and really as a sort of shameless plug, just by a way of example of other pieces of evolution we've made, I wanted to talk about the cooperation agreement I was able to sign about 3 weeks ago now in Sydney with the Australian Securities Investment Commission. For the first time anywhere in the world, two financial regulators have agreed to make it potentially easier for innovative companies to access new markets, and we very much hope that's an example we'll be able to follow with a whole series of our other colleagues around the world. However, as I said, the focus I wanted to have today is very much on another first, which is the UK's regulatory sandbox. Now, this is going to be a bold and it's going to be a complex project for us to deliver, as well as significant benefits on the table that we want to try and release. It obviously carries some degree of risk with it as well. And so it won't just be, I think, firms that will be learning as they go through the concept of a sandbox. It will be us as well as a regulator. As the EST just said a few moments ago, we plan to open our doors to applications on the 9th of May. The firms that are successful, that come forward with, frankly, the best ideas into the sandbox, will be able to test those ideas with us without immediately incurring all of the regulatory consequences that normally flow from being in a financial services market. And I wanted to take this opportunity in the next few minutes to really set out a little bit more what we think the challenges are in operating in this space and some of the questions we've had to try and deal with and overcome, to give you a sense of what the sandbox will actually look like. I think it's one of those rather odd words that might conjure up the idea of a playpen, but you know, what does it actually mean in practice? And then finally unveil some of our thinking about how we take all of this forward. So the key question for us when we were approaching this was really, how do we as a regulator begin to create the concept of a sandbox that gives industry on the one hand the freedom to test new ideas, to break new ground, to come up with innovative solutions and creative solutions to problems, when on the other hand there's very limited public appetite for failure if things go wrong, and that appetite, particularly in financial services, is very, very low indeed. So to try and deal with that problem, we had to ask ourselves really two main questions and answer two sets of challenges. So the first one was, how do we deliver a sandbox that lowers the barriers to testing within the existing regulatory framework? How do we use our existing rules? How do we work within that environment to try and create that space? And then secondly, how do we ensure that if novel ideas are being tested, this just doesn't become a blank check to shift all of the risks of those ideas from firms just being transferred onto the shoulders of consumers? So I'll start with the lowering barriers piece. So one of the first things I would say is we would acknowledge that to date, firms requiring authorisation have had to incur significant costs before they can meaningfully explore consumer appetite or indeed whether their idea will work at all. Our authorisations process is exceptionally rigorous. We really only want firms out there in the market that can meet all of our principles, but we recognise that to get that full authorisation is actually quite a process in itself, however easy we might try to make it. So what we've looked at is something we've done elsewhere already in the area of challenger banks, where we looked at, well, becoming a bank is an incredibly complex process. It's probably one of the most complex regulatory processes that we run alongside the PRA. There we've been able to adopt this concept of partial mobilisation so that people can get authorised for chunks of their business and build them in blocks as they go. And we've seen a real uptick in the number of new challenger banks coming forward with the ability to work in that way. So what we're going to do is to take some of the learnings there and some of the lessons there and say, can we now set up for the Sandbox a tailored authorisations process, which means that Sandbox firms can be authorised with restrictions, allowing them to test their ideas, but no more. They'll still need to apply for authorisation, they'll still need to meet our basic threshold conditions, but, and this is the really important bit for those of you who are real sort of regulatory techies, but only for the purposes of the test that they want to try and carry out. And the concept behind this is really a simple quid pro quo, that the authorisation test should be much easier to meet, and the costs and times to get the test up and running will be reduced because we're only focusing on how does that test work. If a firm gets out there, makes the test is successful, and they want to launch themselves fully into the world with a full range of activity open to all consumers, then it can do so if it can then obviously satisfy the next layer up, the next higher threshold. But again, having had that experiment behind them, we would hope that that becomes a process that they find it easier to meet our standards. Now, we think that strikes the right balance. So what we're trying to do here is achieve regulation that starts in proportion to the size and the scale of an idea and then can basically grow as hopefully that business model grows and begins to become a possible commercial success. Now, we did look at quite closely the idea that we would simply remove authorisation requirements for Sandbox firms altogether. Now, legally, both at European and national level, there are some restrictions that would have limited our ability to do this. But more importantly, and I think this is philosophically the key point here, we concluded that Sandbox firms undertaking regulated activity should sit in the regulatory boundary. So they should be like other firms out there offering financial services. And we should make sure that as a result of that, consumers can be properly protected. That approach also means that if a firm does make a success of its trial, its experiment in the Sandbox, it can obviously make the transition into being a fully regulated entity much more easily, much more simply than having to try and cross that boundary for the first time. And as we've seen with many markets, consumers actually find that having regulation, having the badge of regulation, an incredibly important part of how they develop trust in new and innovative products. So again, we think there's a win-win for everybody here of having some regulation, however proportionate, in place from the start. Another barrier that was put to us was the interpretation of rules. Now, finance is obviously an established industry with many rules that predate smartphones, let alone blockchain or biometric identifiers. We recognise that there could be regulatory uncertainty if something is not an established market practice. And the things we are going to encounter in the Sandbox are almost certainly not going to be established market practices. And so we recognise that firms who are going to come into the Sandbox are going to want to have a dialogue with us as the regulator to get some much greater clarity about where they're positioning themselves over time. To help Sandbox firms in the way that we've done in Project Innovate, we are first of all going to look at how we give them individual guidance. So how do we set out and interpret the rules that they will need to work by? Now, this creates a limited safe space for those firms. If they have the ability to act in accordance with the guidance that we've given them, we, in turn, will proceed on the basis that they've complied with the relevant aspects of our rules to which the guidance relates. We've got a lot of experience of doing that now from Project Innovate, and we think we can bring that into a slightly more experimental space with the Sandbox. Another tool we have in our armoury is the ability to waive or modify our own rules. And this is one of our statutory powers. It's meant to be used for rules which have become unduly burdensome or are not achieving their regulatory objectives. We can't use it to waive European law or primary legislation, obviously, but we do have some room for manoeuvre here, and we're prepared to use it in the Sandbox. Finally, and we fully expect to encounter this situation in the Sandbox, we might have propositions that we've just not seen before, even in a very similar way. So we will have some form of uncharted territory that we may need to go into with firms. So in those cases, it's going to be very difficult for us to say this is how we interpret an existing rule, or this is how we will work around a particular set of issues. In those rare cases, there may be circumstances in which we can use no enforcement action letters. Again, we've not issued those before. We do have the power to issue them. And those letters will basically give comfort to the firms in the Sandbox that as long as they deal with us openly, as long as they keep to the agreed testing parameters and they treat their customers fairly, we accept that unexpected issues may arise in those tests, and we will not take disciplinary action against those firms as long as they've behaved in an honest manner. Those letters obviously are quite a big thing for us to give as a regulator, so they'll only apply for the duration of the test itself, but we do think that this could be quite a valuable part of making sure that the most innovative ideas can actually feel like they can use the Sandbox to come to market. That brings me to the second of the challenges. So this idea of how do you make sure that whilst this is an experiment, whilst that people need to know they're taking part in an experiment, how do you create a safe space on the one hand where firms feel they can genuinely try things out without the regulator about to come upon them like a ton of bricks, but on the other hand, not transfer all of the risk and all of the burden to the shoulders of consumers. So we think there are three important parts in how we think about consumer protection within the Sandbox environment. So the first is, just as in Project Innovate, we will only deal with those firms where we can see very clearly from their proposition there is either a direct or indirect consumer benefit to be had. We do occasionally come across firms who have amazingly innovative ideas, but as I've said to a number of people before, unfortunately they're illegal in about 27 different countries. We're still not going to deal with those kind of guys in the Sandbox. Secondly, we will agree upfront what the testing parameters and safeguards are on a firm-by-firm basis, on a test-by-test basis. We want those involved to feel that they've got some appropriate protections around the propositions being tested and the types of customer and the types of firm that might be involved. So, for example, it might be perfectly reasonable to ask a firm that wants to test something on ordinary retail consumers in a mass market context, that they will put those consumers fully back in their original starting position if a test does not perform as expected. And frankly, I would see that probably applying to the larger firms, perhaps trying to do something very new for the first time. Equally, another firm testing with a smaller group of sophisticated consumers may need to simply have in place some very, very clear disclosures to those consumers as they enter into the test. As a bit of an aside, this concept of informed consent has been raised during the consultation that we've had. And I think it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In a pharmaceutical context, informed consent sometimes means as a person you knowingly give up some rights, particularly to take part in a medical experiment, for example, that you might otherwise have. Now, given this is not a matter of life and death, as it is in that medical context, We don't believe it's appropriate for retail consumers in the sandbox to actually have to give up their rights. But we do think about how can we ensure, for example, there might be sandbox tests where there's a clear disclosure to those consumers that, for example, this is a very limited period of time, it's a very limited test, and then be very clear with those consumers what's going to happen at the end of that. So, we'll come in testing, you may now go somewhere else at the end of this process. Excuse me. That being said, I think there are circumstances we could envisage. Excuse me, sorry, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. Sorry, that's better. That being said, I think we can envisage there may be circumstances in which there is scope for limiting or defining sandbox firms' liabilities up front, particularly if they're testing business-to-business offerings within Sandbox. So again, we think this is going to be very tailored, it's going to be very specific to the firm and the test involved. And then finally, the third and last element, which I already touched on briefly, is that we will require every Sandbox firm to have a fair exit strategy for the consumers involved in that test. Again, depending on those tests, depending on the type of test, those exit strategies may vary significantly. It could be simply there's a defined point at which that business might come to a halt, or it might be a transfer of customers to another third party. Of course, if the test is successful, there's then a question of could those consumers also transition into a longer term, more permanent business. As I mentioned earlier, the Sandbox is a first for financial services regulators, although I think there's quite a lot of interest in doing this in different parts of the world. We ourselves will be experimenting and learning here, as I said earlier, and I expect a high degree of bespoke engagement from our staff. So by necessity, initially we're only going to be able to work with a relatively small number of firms in quite an intensive way. So how we plan to do this is to actually, in a way not dissimilar to how some of the fintech accelerators work, is to use a cohort approach and initially run 2 cohorts a year. That way we can learn what works well, what doesn't. We can improve things hopefully for subsequent cohorts coming into the Sandbox. And what we're going to ask firms to do who are interested in being part of the Sandbox is to give us a short application up front, which really begins to explain how they might match some of the eligibility criteria we think are going to be important. So the first of those is genuine innovation. And the second is, as I've mentioned earlier, the same as for Project Innovate. We think we can see either an indirect or a direct consumer benefit as a result of this new product or new service coming to the market. Third item is that actually this is an idea meant for the UK financial services market. Although we will welcome, I think, anyone coming from around the globe to test ideas, it's clearly got to have a UK basis for us to then regulate it. We need to be able to test any ideas alongside the FCA. You've got to be willing to work with us, particularly around research, particularly around looking at what the effects on consumers might be, and also the readiness to test. So I think there are lots of people who've got ideas out there that they haven't actually developed into real sort of business propositions yet. We're obviously going to look, particularly in the first cohorts, for those who are the most ready to test and the most ready to try and come to market. So that's our Sandbox. We don't see this as the whole story at all, by any way, shape or means. In November, we floated the idea of options for the industry to foster more innovation in the regulatory space, working with us rather than schemes being wholly led by us. And I'm delighted to announce that Innovate Finance has agreed to lead an industry working group to explore options for industry-led sandboxes working alongside our own. We'll be involved in this work and we'll explore what the FCA's role could be in those projects in the future as well. So to conclude, I just wanted to underline this. We're a first regulator anywhere in the world to really launch a sandbox project of this kind. It should underline our deep commitment to innovation. it's an essential part from us of promoting competition. You know, we're not just doing this because we think it's a nice idea or because it's trendy. Actually, this is a core part for us of delivering our regulatory objectives. But perhaps most importantly, this is an experiment, I think, for all involved, including us. And we need to listen and learn as much as we can from the experience and from the firms that are engaged in it, and indeed the consumers that work with it. And it's incredibly important for us that throughout this process we make sure that we still deliver an appropriate degree of protection for consumers. But ultimately, I think there is a really big potential prize here. If between us we can get this right, the Sandbox can play a hugely important part in helping firms get new and exciting ideas to market far more quickly. I look forward to engaging with, I suspect, many, many people in this room, even though it doesn't have an IKEA table, to get ideas out there far more quickly, far more innovatively in the future. And thank you for listening. And I think we're now going to have a panel discussion that tries to take some of these ideas a little further. But I think, you know, from today we can move forward on something very, very new. Thank you.